The Shire began as a deliberate Third Age migration. Small groups of hobbits moved west from the Upper Vales and settled the fertile lands between the Brandywine and the Far Downs, carving out a pastoral polity that stayed mostly out of the larger politics of Middle-earth. That insulation is the key to its reputation. For centuries, the Shire functioned as a quiet, self-contained community, quiet enough that most wider events passed around it rather than through it. But that same isolation also created fragile fault lines, concentrated landholdings, informal power structures, and an economy dependent on a narrow set of resources. Those fault lines matter because they turn the familiar image of peaceful hobbit life into something more complicated. Over the long timeline that follows the Shire's founding, episodes of coercion, environmentally damaging industry, and political manipulation repeatedly surface. The decisive change comes with increased contact from outside powers, contractors, rangers, and eventually the wider turmoil of the War of the Ring. Once external pressures arrive, the Shire's institutional weaknesses stop being hypothetical. They become crises that reshape its land, its leadership, and the myths that people tell about hobbit life. The Shire's small, harmless feel was deliberate. Hobbits moved into Eriador in the Third Age, and over a few generations turned the land between the Brandywine and the Far Downs into a contiguous, familiar world. They kept it small by design. The Shire was intended as a self-contained economy of farms, gardens, village greens, and local markets. That inwardness let it avoid most of Middle-earth's larger conflicts for centuries, but it also made the Shire fragile in ways that would matter later. Settlement was a patchwork affair. Small groups cleared hedgerows, drained marshes, and linked isolated homesteads with tracks. Those holdings gradually consolidated into districts and, administratively, into 4 farthings: north, south, east, Buckland, and west, a map that reflected local geography and village life rather than centralized power. The farthings provided boundaries for disputes, jurisdictions for minor offences, and a crude way to coordinate roads and market days. Localism was deliberate. Law and authority operated at a face-to-face scale. That scale produced modest offices. The Thane, a hereditary leader tied to the Took family, existed to muster able-bodied hobbits and serve as a military figurehead, tradition more than a standing army, but a clear centre of authority. The mayor of Michel Delving handled civic administration, presided over the largest market, and ran the courts there. Sheriffs enforced local ordinances. Constables and the village watch were neighbours rather than professionals. Governance worked through custom as much as statute. Matham speech, passing on useful objects, greeting strangers with polite obfuscation, and favouring social ritual over formal records, shaped property and exchange so that gifts, bargains, and favours often mattered more than contracts. Economically, the Shire was a network of smallholders and artisans. Most hobbits were yeomen or tenant farmers who tilled a few acres, kept a pig or cow, and sold surplus at market. Local commerce included millers, smiths, wheelwrights, and alehouses. Mathams, accumulated passed-down goods, sustained a second-hand economy and kept capital circulating informally. A handful of families held disproportionate land and influence. The Tooks, centred at the Great Smiles in Tuckborough, were the most prominent old line. The Brandybucks of Buckland maintained semi-autonomy across the river, and the Bagginses of Hobbiton came to stand for respectable, conservative prosperity. These names were loci of patronage, marriage alliances, and local prestige. Land use and resource management reflected conservative practices. Hedgerows and patchwork fields formed a mosaic of orchards, pasture, coppice woodlands, and small woods managed for steady timber. Commons and shared grazing survived alongside private plots. Industry meant watermills, lime kilns, and craft workshops, not factories. That restraint preserved the pastoral character, but left resources in a delicate balance. A dry season, livestock disease, or organised felling could cascade through an economy built on intimate interdependence. Socially, the Shire combined apparent ease with entrenched hierarchy. Wealthy households influenced who held the mayoralty or sat on councils. The Thane's ceremonial authority translated into real power when mustering men. Buckland's brandybucks operated with their own customs and defences. A few large holdings rose above a broad base of smallholders and day labourers. Mobility existed, but moved slowly through marriage, inheritance, or commerce rather than open institutions. Politically, insulation was a double-edged sword. Lacking a standing bureaucracy or professional military made the Shire adaptable in ordinary times and difficult to dominate by simple administrative takeover. But it also meant no robust means for large-scale coordination or defence. Customary law solved fences and petty theft, but was ill-suited to systematic pressures, waves of hired woodsmen, organised land purchases, or the imposition of foreign rules backed by force. The Thane and Mayor could call resistance, but there was no trained militia with reserves of men, supplies, or logistics to repel an occupying power. These choices, smallholding, local governance, family dominance, and conservative land management, made for centuries of peace and contentment while producing specific vulnerabilities. Economically and legally, the Shire was set up to manage neighbourly disputes, not enterprise on an industrial scale or coercive outside interests. Ecologically, controlled woodland management and small-scale agriculture meant large-scale exploitation would be particularly damaging. Socially, the prominence of a few families created obvious points of leverage for outsiders. By the time external pressures arrived, traders offering distant goods, timbermen cutting for distant markets, outlaws testing limits, the Shire presented a tempting target. Resource-rich, weak in centralised defence, and governed by customs that could be bent through bribery or intimidation. The same foundations that produced rural contentment had quietly planted the seeds of later crisis. The Shire's long peace encouraged complacency that began to show as the wider world returned to Eriador. Trade routes reopened, more merchants passed through Bree and the North Road, and a taste for finer goods and conveniences grew among prosperous hobbits. Cottage industries expanded beyond household scale. Those changes brought money into Hobbiton and Michel delving, but also new actors, timber merchants, itinerant labourers, and men who answered to no Hobbit custom. The Shire had never been organised for extraction. Woodlands and hedgerows were managed for local needs, fuel, building, occasional timber. So when outside markets paid well for large quantities, neighbourly coppicing became commercial felling. Illegal cutting crept along borders, stream banks were altered to float logs, hedgerows were broken to gain access. At first, the effects were small. A few families made extra coin, others resented the loss of shelter and privacy. Over a decade, those small alterations added up into ecological change. Wetter fields, more exposed lanes, fewer cover and natural buffers. Changes the Shire's customs and slow, informal enforcement could not reverse quickly. Where labour turned commercial, social obligations frayed. Hiring a dozen men for a major job was new. Hiring men with no ties to the community undermined reciprocal bonds that had kept Hobbit society civil. These hired hands answered to pay, not kin, and were often rough in ways Hobbits distrusted. A family could bring in strangers to fell trees or build barns. Those strangers might lodge in abandoned outbuildings, stay on, and introduce petty theft, threats, and disputes that shame and neighbourly arbitration handled poorly. The Shire's institutions were designed for neighbourly arbitration, not for policing a money-driven economy. The Thane had become a traditional military representative, mostly ceremonial in a long peace. The Mayor of Michel Delving handled markets and festivals. Sheriffs were local officers. Matham circulation kept social ties intact. None of these mechanisms were set up to absorb large infusions of capital or to resist organised interests that used bribery and muscle. Wealthy families could convert money into influence, market seats, favourable contracts, or informal control of supply. The Sackville-Bagginses illustrate the shift. Their search for status and investment led them to buy property, make loans, and press petty claims. Their actions were not always illegal, but they were socially corrosive, eroding norms by turning cash into leverage. That corrosion became institutional. Fees and licenses for crop sales or woodcutting appeared, enforced by men who answered to local magnates. A small fine here, a confiscated cart there. Each seemed trivial until custom itself shifted. Where community censure had been the primary sanction, cash payments and hired intimidation replaced public shame. Those who could pay skirted old obligations. Those who could not were squeezed and isolated. Disputes that once ended on green benches increasingly required formal rulings, which could be bought or manipulated. New criminal structures followed naturally. Small crews employed to clear land or haul timber evolved into rentiers of coercion. They occupied cottages, collected protection fees, and muscled markets by blocking certain merchants or intimidating customers. The sheriffs could respond to theft and brawls, but they were unpaid or poorly resourced volunteers who depended on neighbourly goodwill. There were no reserves of trained men or supplies. When intimidation hardened into seizure, cottages occupied, rights-of-way fenced, commons enclosed, custom and appeal to authority proved slow and ineffective against organised men backed by outside capital. Politically, the prominence of a few families made the Shire easy to manipulate. An ambitious hobbit with sufficient wealth could buy influence by placing allies in market roles or by making loans that became leverage. Lotho's Sackville-Baggins shows the danger in miniature. He used family position and wealth to win allies, consolidate property, and present himself as an indispensable manager. His rise demonstrates how respectable enterprise and avarice blurred in a culture lacking norms for large-scale commercial governance. He did not seize power with laws or banners. He accumulated it through estate purchases, control of supplies, and co-opting office holders. Magistrates and mayors who depended on the new wealth often preferred short-term stability and personal comfort to defending customary rights rigorously. Outside forces exploited these weaknesses. Displaced men and mercenaries from elsewhere, driven by hunger, land loss, or lords' whims, found employment under local magnates who had motives beyond commerce. Their readiness to use force where hobbits would use argument made them useful tools for any power seeking to impose rule without open campaigning. When institutions are weak and customs strong, it is cheaper to buy or intimidate the few levers of power than to win hearts.
In the Shire, those levers were obvious: leading families, market centres, and the Thane's comparative inability to act decisively. By the time these pressures coalesced into an organised attempt at takeover, the Shire had become brittle. Its formal structures, titles, councils, sheriffs, remained, but many had hollowed out. Money and hired muscle had introduced new rules of reward and punishment that ran counter to long-standing norms. Ecology had been altered in ways that reduced self-sufficiency, and social networks had been weakened by wage-dependent, mobile labour. What had once been a resilient rural polity, capable of absorbing shocks through mutual aid, had been transformed into a place where legal forms existed without the cultural muscle to enforce them. That brittleness did not make collapse inevitable, but it made it cheap. An organised force with a leader willing to exploit local fissures could convert gradual change into rapid occupation. The Shire's weaknesses, marketable forests, influential families susceptible to bribery, a population unused to standing armies, were legible to anyone who cared to look. Those vulnerabilities set the stage for the decisive intervention that followed, a combination of political cunning and brute force, testing how deep Hobbit resilience really ran. When the hollowed institutions of the Shire met a leader who knew how to exploit them, change stopped being gradual and became violent. Saruman returned under the name Sharkey and inserted himself into Lotho Sackville-Baggins's brief regime, first as a fixer and then as the power behind a ragged band of ruffians. What followed was deliberate social engineering, a campaign to transform a small-holding, reciprocal economy into something extractive and controllable. Orchards and hedgerow gave way to industrial clearance. Trees were felled on an industrial scale. Copses were grubbed out for roads, fences, and stock enclosures. The party tree, the symbol of communal life, was cut down. Watercourses were altered for mills and drains. Where the Shire had run on seasonal labour and reciprocal favours, workplaces with fixed wages and harsh overseers appeared. These hired hands, many outsiders or men bought with coin, did not share Hobbit customs. They enforced new property lines and collected rents that had never been part of Shire practice. Political power was rapidly centralised in forms that looked official but lacked local legitimacy. Lotho named himself chief, posted orders and fines, and used money and muscle to seize houses and smiles. Sheriffs and reeves colluded or were replaced by men loyal to the new regime. Title papers, ordinances, and proclamations were weaponized against the very customs hobbits had relied on for generations. Dispossession proceeded as much by bureaucracy, names removed from deeds, cellar keys taken, as by direct force. That coercion had a material face. Men were rounded up for forced labour, clearing woods, building dry stone works, carting timber, while families were driven into cramped, surveilled quarters. Resistance meant arrest, beatings, or worse. Environmental damage was immediate. Hedgerows gone, wildlife disturbed, soil compacted by heavy carts and mills. The small orchards, shared pastures, and kitchen gardens that sustained Hobbit self-sufficiency were repurposed to feed the occupiers' production lines. In short order, the Shire had been turned into a territory optimized for extraction and control rather than for Hobbit life. The occupiers miscalculated how quickly their victory would dissolve. The return of Frodo, Sam, Merry, and Pippin changed the dynamic. These hobbits brought combat experience, moral authority, and a refusal to treat the problem as one for outsiders. They organized a specifically hobbit-led insurgency that used local knowledge and social ties as weapons.
Tactically, the resistance ran two complementary tracks. Small, mobile bands struck ruffian patrols, freed prisoners, and sabotaged infrastructure. The ruffians were no regular army. Lacking cohesion and morale, they buckled under guerrilla pressure, pressed from familiar terrain and community support. Simultaneously, the returning hobbits reassembled the social web, kin networks, neighbourhood committees, and trusted tradesmen, to coordinate food, shelter for refugees, intelligence on enemy movements, and the reconstruction of local militias. These improvised forces were not formal armies, but were better motivated and disciplined than hired thugs, because they defended home and hearth. The campaign reached its climax at Bywater and around Michel Delving. Those battles were short but decisive. Ruffians, stripped of command and facing disciplined hobbit fighters, were routed. With the military threat contained, the struggle moved to reclaiming civic space. Occupiers were rounded up, looted properties were inventoried, stolen deeds and goods were traced. Principal collaborators, Lotho among them, were removed from power. Lotho died amid the regime's collapse. Saruman, who meddled directly at the end, was confronted and slain, ending the ideological force behind the industrial program. Reconstruction required legal and ecological work. Civic offices resumed practical functions. The Thainship and Mayor's Office, community courts, and local councils began enforcing Shire law instead of imposed ordinances. Paperwork that had robbed people was used to restore titles and adjudicate claims. Those who profited from the occupation were stripped of ill-gotten gains where possible. Ruffians were expelled or punished. The returning leaders deliberately balanced accountability with restoration, aiming to rebuild social bonds rather than replace one domination with another. Ecological repair was equally practical. The party field was replanted. Saplings replaced felled oaks. Hedgerows were resown and stone walls rebuilt. Where mills had scarred riverbanks, channels were eased and floodplains returned to grazing. Replanting was political as much as practical. It reasserted community control over the land and signalled a collective commitment to repair. That work could not erase every loss. Some soils were degraded,
and ancient trees were gone forever. The Shire's landscape retained traces of the occupation. New fences to be removed, rerouted lanes, and those scars lasted. The Scouring reshaped Hobbit politics and habits. The occupation taught distrust of easy comforts and outside experts, and revalorized local knowledge, neighborly mutual aid, and the enforcement of custom by communities rather than by distant authority. Many who had once accepted small, corrupt bargains now demanded legal redress. Civic offices acquired new expectations of accountability. Those shifts are visible in what followed. Samwise Gamgee's long mayoralty, his work restoring gardens and planting trees, and a general reassertion of institutions that had previously been more ornamental than operative. The Shire did not become militarized, but the memory of occupation hardened political habits. More vigilance, skepticism toward outsiders, and a keener sense that pastoral life required active stewardship. The Scouring's legacy was twofold: an immediate recovery achieved by organized resistance and civic repair, and a deeper, lasting change in how hobbits governed themselves. The party field could be replanted and fences taken down, but the visible scars and the political memory remained. From complacency, the Shire moved toward a guarded resilience, still pastoral and small-scale, but no longer naively insulated from the political forces beyond its borders. In the end, the Shire survived because hobbits chose to act. Isolation and complacency let corruption and foreign occupation take root, but resistance, legal redress, and hands-on restoration expelled it. The Scouring didn't militarize hobbitry, it taught practical civic remedies, accountability for officials, communal enforcement of custom, and a renewed esteem for neighborly labor. Sam's long mayoralty and the return of gardens and fences show how recovery was deliberate work, not automatic mercy. The visible scars and political memory that remained mattered. They hardened a commitment to stewardship and vigilance without erasing the Shire's small-scale, pastoral character. The clear takeaway is this: the Shire's pastoral image is the result of repair, not uninterrupted innocence. Its safety after the War of the Ring was earned through courage at home and restitution afterward, not a return to how things were, but a rebuilding towards something steadier.